Alright, today we're going to be talking about China when it reunified after the fall of the Han Dynasty. So we'll be covering the Sui, the Tang, and the Song Dynasties, and that'll run from sometime in the 500s to sometime in the 1200s. Alright, so let's just go ahead and take it away. This is a really exciting time period in China's history. They were able to do something that the areas that had been Rome were unable to do, which is kind of reunify, reform, and then reach even greater heights than they had during the classical period under the Han. In the background, you can see a pretty famous Chinese scroll, which shows the capital of the Song Dynasty. And you can see that there's just a ton of activity going on in the background. There's a ton of different food stalls. There's all kinds of carts and people. There's boats moving along the river. And then there's this really cool rainbow bridge, which has all these kind of cantilevered supports that allow it to span the bridge without having like piers that move down from the bridge into the water. So it's going to be a really cool time period. There's going to be a lot of really neat developments, inventions, population growth, busyness, economic awesomeness. So let's go ahead and hear about the Sui, which is the dynasty that reunifies China. So back in 220 CE, that's where we left off with China. The Han Dynasty had fallen mostly to pastoralist invasions, but also to peasant rebellions. And China had a period of disunity for several hundred years, but it wasn't as long or as difficult as the fall of the Roman Empire had been in Western Europe. We talked last week about how Europe had fallen into a period that we call the medieval period, when it was disunified politically with that feudal system and really local economically with the manorial system. And China was pretty much the exact opposite of that. It will reunify, have a centralized government, and be a huge economic powerhouse. One thing that does take root in that period when there is disunification, though, is Buddhism. And people were kind of shaken by the fall of the Han Dynasty. They were willing to accept an outside belief system because it seemed like maybe the past ways of doing things were not very effective when the Han Dynasty fell. And they were also looking for some kind of guide to life, something that would give them a little bit more clarity and understanding. And so a lot of people turned to Buddhism, which was filtering across the Silk Roads by the time that the Han period was coming to a close. And that conversion rate really picked up after the Han Dynasty fell. Now, finally, in 589, China is reunified under the dynasty called the Sui. And this dynasty only lasts about 30 years because it's a pretty harsh legalistic dynasty, as you might expect when someone's trying to reunify. So they will use legalism to bring the country back together. Alright, the Sui dynasty is going to have this massive focus on building projects. They're going to rebuild huge sections of the Great Wall to protect themselves from the nomadic invasions that had caused the fall of the Han. And they're also going to build a really, really important structure, which I'd like you to put a little star or a llama beside, and that is the Grand Canal. It's going to link up the Huanghe, or the Yellow River, up here in the north, with the Yangtze River, which runs here in the south. And this southern area of China is a lot warmer. It's a rice-producing region. And this region up here in the north is sort of the traditional center of the civilization, as we learned, way back in the Song Dynasty and the Zhou Dynasty. So what it does is kind of link up these two ecological zones. You've got the northern zone and then this southern zone. And now that you've got this canal that links the two, you can have a huge amount of economic productivity going on, because it's almost like it had the same sort of advantage that the Mediterranean Sea gave to the Roman Empire, a kind of like inland water-based route that allowed you to increase economic productivity in a time period when overland travel was really expensive and difficult. So, again, it creates this huge economic zone. And one of the advantages of this, of course, was a huge population boom because champa rice had moved up from what is today Vietnam. So down here in Southeast Asia, champa rice was beginning to be grown, and that's that drought-resistant version that we read about in that article by Linda Schaefer called Southernization. And that rice starts to get grown in China in this southern area, and now all of a sudden that rice can be shipped to other parts of China easily because this 1,200-mile long Grand Canal pulls it all together. All right. The Sui Dynasty is going to restore the Confucian exam system and the Confucian bureaucracy. It had kind of fallen by the wayside after the Han Dynasty had collapsed. They'll also do something really important, so I'd like you to put a star by this one as well. They will utilize labor taxes. And labor taxes are just like monetary taxes, except you don't pay money, you pay your tax in labor. So, say the government says, okay, peasants, you don't have a lot of cash, but you definitely have, yourself. So you're going to come for 2 weeks out of every year and you're going to work on government projects. So it's like if instead of paying the U.S. government taxes, you could go out and do road construction for several weeks. It's that sort of system. So labor taxes were huge. They were able to, all of the dynasties of China pretty much utilize peasant labor taxes, and they're able to extract a huge amount of work out of their peasants and get a ton of really cool big projects done, like the Great Wall and the Grand Canal. The Sui Dynasty ends pretty quickly. Again, it was harsh, it was legalistic. People were not very happy under Sui rule. Very similar to the Qin Dynasty. If you guys remember, the Qin Dynasty was the very first real unified dynasty of China, and it was founded by the guy who created that big terracotta warrior tomb. And it ended in really the same kind of way. So that legalistic system, like the Qin and the Sui have, are kind of overly harsh, and people don't really do very well. And so pretty much both of those dynasties ended in overthrows because of the harshness of the rule. So we move into the Tang Dynasty period next. And I want you to take a look at this map because you can see how large China was in this period. And you can also see how focused China was on controlling trade routes. Out here, you can see them controlling Silk Road trade all the way out into modern Central Asia. Oops. Sorry about that. You can also see the Tang Dynasty's neighbors. You've got a ton of different Central Asian groups. The Uyghurs, kind of to the north central area, the Khitans up here. All of these sort of semi-nomadic or nomadic pastoralists were threats to both the Tang and the Song Dynasty, and they're going to constantly be battling to preserve their borders and keep themselves safe from the threat that all of these different nomads posed. Okay, so the Tang Dynasty gets going almost right after the Sui Dynasty falls. A new military man, restored order, becomes a new emperor, claims the mandate of heaven, etc. And the Tang Dynasty goes on pretty much to be one of the top dynasties ever in Chinese history. It was a really, really huge golden age, and you can see that the dynasty lasts for quite a long time, about 300 years. And of course, they extended their borders. They controlled a lot of Central Asia, Mongolia, some of modern Tibet, and all the way down into parts of Southeast Asia and Korea. And like the Han Dynasty, the Tang Dynasty deals with its neighbors through the system called the tribute system. And the idea is, and you guys read about this in your Strayer textbook, the theory is that China is the center of civilization, and everyone wants to be a part of that radiating civilization. So naturally, they come to the emperor and they bow in submission to the Chinese and to the emperor. And then the emperor acknowledges them, gives them gifts, and they can have a formal relationship. Strayer also pointed out, though, that the tribute system sometimes does not work that way. For example, if the central government of China is weak, what ends up happening in the tribute system, they kind of leave that veneer of the tribute system over the top, but what really starts to happen is that the Chinese government has to give the nomads a ton of presents to make them go away and stop invading. So the system is supposed to be based on Chinese strength and Chinese superiority, and it depends on how strong China actually was, whether they were able to pull that off completely. They definitely, as I said before, control the Silk Road trade, and you can see them militarily extending out into Central Asia in order to do that. There's an interesting side note, and I think that Strayer went over it briefly. The Tang Dynasty in the 700s actually met up in battle against the Abbasid Caliphate that we've already learned about, way out by the Talas River, I think in 751. And there was the biggest battle that you've never heard about, I suppose, went down there, and it's actually the battle in which the knowledge of paper began to trade hands, just through that cultural contact that those two huge and really important civilizations had when they met in battle way out in Central Asia, as they both kind of worked to control Silk Road trade. All right. The Tang Dynasty also had a strong economy, not only due to trade, but also due to their infrastructure. They kept up the Grand Canal that had been built by the Sui. They continued to make silk, although it was no longer a monopoly. The secret of silk had gotten out sometime in between the Han and the Sui dynasties, and other countries had started to make silk, especially in Persia, which at that point was part of the Abbasid Caliphate. All right. The Tang Dynasty has this really strong overlay of Central Asian influence, and the Tang Dynasty rulers are really big cultural patrons. They have a lot of artwork, poetry, painting, all that kind of stuff comes out in this period, and you can see a really strong influence of outside cultures. Some people in the Tang Dynasty capital even lived in the kind of housing that you see out on the Central Asian steppe, the movable housing that the pastoralists use. And you can see musical instruments moving in from Central Asia over the Silk Road's trade. You can see a lot of Buddhist art that gets patronized by the rulers. And of course, there's a really strong centralized government. Just like the Sui, they kept the bureaucracy and the Confucian exam system going, and they had a bunch of different ministries like war, justice, and public works. So you might work in a specific branch of the government bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy doesn't just touch the capital city. It extends all the way out into the far reaches of Central Asia. Anywhere that the Tang Dynasty controls, they have trained, educated, government-approved bureaucrats out in those very far away districts, so you could kind of feel the central government's presence even in your local area. All right. Now, although there is this Confucian exam system that the Tang Dynasty is utilizing, that Buddhism that had moved in during the period between the Han and the Sui was still really strong, and you saw a lot of patronization of the Buddhist arts by various Tang Dynasty emperors. Again, they had that strong connection to nomadic roots. A lot of the Tang Dynasty rulers were kind of related to various nomadic groups, and so they were more willing to take on what were considered foreign religions like Buddhism, which of course came from India. Mahayana Buddhism, which is the type of Buddhism in which there are a lot of bodhisattvas and the Buddha is venerated as a god, is the most important type of Buddhism that existed in China at the time. But you also saw the development of what is called Chan or Zen Buddhism. Those are the same thing. And that was more about meditation and things like this little bonsai tree right there. That's actually an aspect of Zen Buddhism as it appears in Japan. But that kind of meditation on nature and finding beauty in nature was a really important part of Zen Buddhism. And what we'll see later in class, and we'll talk about this a little bit more extensively, is that the Tang Dynasty is ridiculously influential in other parts of East Asia, especially Japan, Korea, and to some extent in Vietnam. And Buddhism especially spreads into those areas from China during the Tang Dynasty. There are a lot of Tang emperors that patronize Buddhism. Empress Wu is perhaps the most important, and she's your only empress in her own right that you get in Chinese history. And women in the Tang Dynasty, as you can see from the fact that there was even an empress who ruled in the period, the Tang Dynasty is a lot more liberal in terms of its views on women. Although it certainly isn't modern in any way, women had a lot larger scope for influence than they will in later Chinese history. You can see a lot of the influence of Buddhism here. This is called the Goose Pagoda. That's my own picture of it. This was a really huge pagoda, obviously, built, I think, in the late 600s out in Xi'an, which had been the capital of China during the Han Dynasty. And of course, you can see the influence of Buddhism in a lot of the sculptures that exist around China still today. All right. There begins to be some conflict toward the end of the Tang Dynasty, mostly arising out of jealousy. Confucians at the imperial court and Taoists at the imperial court, but especially Confucians, really disliked the level of support and attention that Buddhist clerics, monks, anything really got from the emperor and from the centralized government. And Confucians began leading almost like crusades to get rid of Buddhism. There was a really good quote that Strayer gave in that chapter, which we'll read more of in class. It was just a speech that was given against Buddhism. Strayer said from this speech in front of the emperor, now the Buddha was of barbarian origin. His language differed from Chinese speech. His clothes were of a different cut. He did not recognize the relationship between prince and subject, nor the sentiments of father and son. He's referring to filial piety there, and the idea of harmonious relationships as described by Confucius. It says, I pray that your majesty will turn this bone, which was a relic of the Buddha, over to the officials that it may be cast into the water or fire. So basically, Confucians really were not cool with the level of Buddhist influence that existed in China. And they eventually win the day, and in 845, the emperor begins persecuting Buddhists and destroys, through burning, a huge number of monasteries, and he makes monks and nuns return to civilian lives. And a lot of this probably was helped because the government was losing a huge amount of money because the Buddhist monasteries were religious organizations. They were not taxed the way that other organizations or land estates were. And so the government really wanted to get that tax revenue. So I'm sure that the economic reasons also played into why the Tang eventually turned away from Buddhism and began burning the monasteries after 845. So the Tang Dynasty, their central control had begun to wane already. Eventually, there was a rebellion against the Tang, and it was crushed, but the Tong Dynasty never really recovered. Um, of course, the decline of the Tang gets blamed on a lady, even though it really didn't have much to do with her. Um, there was a story that the emperor's favorite concubine and her family sort of used her position with the emperor to promote their own family interests and eventually to conduct this rebellion. And of course, that's a bit overstated. Um, the Song Dynasty kind of liked to play that story up a lot more to sort of as like a moral tale. This is what happens when ladies, get too much power. The whole dynasty will collapse. So the Tang Dynasty, central control weakens, and eventually it will fade out. However, very soon afterwards, the Song Dynasty comes into being. A new military commander claims the mandate of heaven, and the Song Dynasty is going to have a very strong focus on dealing with northern nomadic pastoralists but beyond the Great Wall. And the Song Dynasty is actually divided into two periods. So out to the side of the heading for this area where it says Song Dynasty 960 to 1279, will you just add that there's a period called the Northern Song Dynasty and there's a period called the Southern Song Dynasty. And the Southern Song Dynasty comes later. It's the one that ends in 1279. And it just occurs as the Song Dynasty is pushed further and further south by those barbarian pastoralists who breach the Great Walls, stream into China, and create insecurity. And the Song Dynasty has to keep kind of retreating. They actually move their whole capital to a different place. Now, before all that rigmarole with the pastoralists, the Song Dynasty has hundreds of years of awesomeness. And they have a golden age, especially economically, with something that's called the Song Commercial Revolution. I'd like you to put a few underlines under that phrase and maybe a little star out to the side. All right. The Song Dynasty is just really awesome. They have very steady population growth. Strayer stated that at the beginning of the Tang Dynasty, there were about 60 to 80 million people in China, and by the end of the Song Dynasty, there's somewhere between 120 and 160 million people, so almost double the population growth by about 1200. It was highly urbanized. About 10% of the population lived in cities. That's more people than will live in cities until the modern period after the Industrial Revolution. The commercial revolution that they undergo in order to achieve this kind of amazing economic growth is backed by paper money, which is invented in China along with paper itself. They'll also invent a banking system and credit, which they refer to as flying money. The largest cities on earth are all in China at this time, maybe with the exception of Baghdad, which was also pretty large, but not really anywhere very close to Hangzhou, which has over 1 million people in it. Please put a little star beside the port of Canton or Guangzhou. It becomes the world's busiest trading center, and we're going to see Canton pop up again and again and again. This area of China is where modern-day Hong Kong is, and the Canton region is famous for trade. It's on that southern coast of China, and it will feature largely in the period around the 17 and 1800s. So we'll come back and we'll talk about Canton later on in the year. The Song Dynasty attempts to make land distribution more equitable, but it's not very successful at that. It tries to break up the power of the aristocracy by dividing up their land among peasants. Of course, people who are rich and powerful are not very cool with having their rich powerfulness taken away from them. So the Song Dynasty's efforts are valiant but not very successful in the long run. Okay, let's talk about awesome stuff that the Tang Dynasty comes up with. Paper gunpowder, compasses, paper money, banks, a credit system, which again they called flying money. They came up with restaurants, movable type, a good 600 years before Europe ever came up with movable type, and junk ships. And I've got a picture of a junk ship right up here. These are huge, and they actually have separated compartments in the hull, kind of like the Titanic had, where each area of the hull is separated from the other. So say there's like a hole that breaches the side of the junk ship. It would fill that compartment, but it wouldn't sink the whole ship because of the dividers down here in the hull. And so all this stuff, of course, comes into being in China. It all spreads through diffusion. For example, paper spreading through the contact of the Tang Dynasty with the Abbasid Caliphate. The idea of paper money falls by the wayside, actually, by the end of the Song Dynasty, but of course it's revived, and we still use paper money today. All of these inventions really allow the Song Dynasty to create a uniquely strong economy, an economy that was larger than anything that had been seen up to that point, and then included a huge amount, actually, of industrial output in the form of like iron production. And the Song Dynasty in the 1200s will actually have iron production levels that are not reached again until the mid 1800s in England during the Industrial Revolution. Alright, religion is a big deal in the Song Dynasty. Confucianism is fully restored to its previous position of authority and prominence, and you get a new type of Confucianism called NeoConfucianism, amazingly named. And the goal of Neo-Confucianism is to promote and secure the superiority of Confucianism as a Chinese thought system over any other foreign system, especially Buddhism. And they do this in a really tricky way. Neo-Confucian philosophy states unequivocally, without any doubt, that Confucianism is the only and the best system. But it kind of slips a lot of Buddhist and Taoist ideas in through the back door. So it's a little bit disingenuous, a little bit dishonest. It is kind of saying one thing, but it filters in a few Buddhist and Taoist ideas into the background anyway, because people have gotten so used to thinking in those ways. So Neo-Confucianism is going to have a really strong hold on China throughout the Song Dynasty and then really into the next few dynasties as well. This Neo-Confucianism definitely influences art and literature in the Song Dynasty. They have very high standards for what an educated person is supposed to be interested in and be able to do. So any proper educated gentleman in the Song Dynasty is supposed to be very competent in their usually bureaucratic position, right? Because those were the highest positions to have in terms of the social hierarchy. You wanted to be right up there with the emperor, serving China in one of the very top posts in the capital of Hangzhou, in one of those main 6 bureaucracies. So as you did your practical job, you also wanted to be able to appreciate kind of the finer things in life, and write poems, paint pictures. We have a ton of paintings and artworks, actually, calligraphy, poems written by and produced by emperors of China, because they were supposed to partake, of course, in this kind of elite culture of being an educated person who was good at all these different things. Art celebrates the natural world. It's very interesting to look at Chinese art and compare it with art from Western Europe, for example. Western Europe features humans as the main focus. But in China, the main focus is nature, and the humans are always very small. And evidence of people within natural settings is always very small. You might see a house, but it's just a tiny, tiny little thing, overwhelmed by like a big mountain in the background, for example. You see a lot of poetry, Li Bo and Du Fu are the two most famous poets from this period. So put a little circle or highlight around their name, maybe a little cloud or a little llama beside them. I have a little poem from Li Bo here. You can see when you read it, it's a very, I don't know, ethereal, right? It's kind of otherworldly, has a lot of deep thoughts in it. And of course, when landscapes are painted, because the focus is, again, is on natural things, they're painted on these really long scrolls, and you would sort of read the scene as the scroll is unfolded, and these scrolls could be really, really long. And an interesting aspect of Chinese art is that the viewer is supposed to kind of participate in the artwork over time. For example, we would never go to a museum and like jot our signature on the Mona Lisa to say that we had participated in and viewed that painting. But in China, if you owned a really awesome artwork on a scroll, when it was brought out, it was a big event. It wasn't usually hung up on the wall, it would be brought out on certain occasions. And there would be, for example, in the emperor's court, a big event in which everyone would go look at this scroll. And if you were important enough, you would take your signature seal, it was a little stamp, and you'd actually stamp it on the scroll. So you could sort of participate with that artwork over time, and you could see the stamps of other emperors or high officials that had also viewed that scroll in previous years. So it's a really interesting system that is kind of unfamiliar to people who live in the West. Here's a really nice example of Chinese artwork. You can see that there are people and houses, but they're really dwarfed by nature. There's this little boat here. And here's the other nice cool thing. You can see the stamp. This is either of the artist or the calligrapher. And then there are verses here. This is a poem, probably. I'm sorry, I can't read it, but my assumption is that that's a poem. So what happens in Chinese art, again, is that they mix the media, mix the different art forms together. And again, it's just a really unique aspect of that Chinese art. You can see down here is a stamp of another of the creators. Maybe that's of the calligrapher, and that stamp might be of the actual painter. Alright, the last topic that we're going to cover is women in this period. This is another really cool artwork from back in the day. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different stamps on this one. So you can see that it's been looked at by a lot of different people through time. And it depicts women riding on horseback with men who are wearing pants, which of course is a Central Asian invention. You gotta have pants if you're gonna ride horses around. And this is in the Tong Dynasty because women would have never ever been out riding horses in the Song Dynasty, and we'll talk about that really quickly. The influence of Buddhism, as well as the influence of nomadic pastoralists from the north, really allows women more freedom than they would have had otherwise during the Tang Dynasty. It doesn't mean that they are of equal status at all, but they had more freedom than they would have otherwise. We have sculptures and paintings of women, for example, playing polo, which is a sport that was brought, I think, from Persia over the Silk Roads into China during this period. So women had an active role, not equal, but definitely they were still out there doing stuff. NeoConfucianism completely reverses that. And it doesn't just reverse it, it takes it back to a really, really bad place. NeoConfucianism justifies in all ways the subordination of women. Remember, Confucius is about harmonious relationships. And Neo-Confucianism is like a really, really strict version of Confucianism. So it reinforces the idea that women are supposed to be confined within the home, chaste, and loyal to their husbands. It does not have those same standards for men. And you can kind of see the difference in status in the fact that men often kept concubines without scandal. whereas that would, of course, never happen in the opposite direction. Neo-Confucians attacked Buddhists of the Tang Dynasty for promoting women as independent without the governance of men, without the governance of their father or their husband. When they went away to be nuns in monasteries, they were not monitored in the way that Confucians felt that women should be, secluded and kept at home. Women were excluded from the educational system, and the most obvious form of female subjugation in this period, I want you to put a big llama beside this one, is foot binding. And we will look at foot binding more extensively in class. I'll talk to you about the process. But what it does over a period of several years is crush the bones of the foot into kind of a little hook shape, and the foot becomes really small. And the goal is to have the foot, the ideal, I suppose, is to have the foot be 3 inches. Obviously, if your feet are 3, 4, 5, 6 inches, it's not even possible to walk on them. And there's no better example of the level of control and subjugation that women experienced during this period than really foot binding. And foot binding is going to last right up until the early 20th century, amazingly. It will keep going for a really long time in China. So we actually have a few, not many, but a few women who are still alive today whose feet were bound. So that's it for today. Again, as always, if you have questions, bring them to class. Make sure that you've got your reading questions done, as well as this little lecture.